Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein, and welcome to this special bonus episode of the Startup Podcast. This is a recording of a live webinar that I did with Ben Wirtz at scalableleaders.com and goes a bit more into me and my story, my journey to leadership in tech, my philosophy, and how I think about leading a team. So, if you're interested in getting to learn a little bit more about me, stick around. This was a deep conversation with one of the most thoughtful leadership coaches I know. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off.
Welcome, everybody, to the Fireside Chat series Tech Leaders in Focus, brought to you by Scalable Leaders. Today, we're going to talk to Yaniv Bernstein, who is the ex-COO and ex-VP of Engineering at Airtasker, founder at Circular, founder of the Startup Podcast, or co-host, I should probably say, and also ex-engineering manager at Google. Over the last few years, there's been a realization that the transition into leadership roles is harder in tech. That means design, engineering, data, product management, cybersecurity. And the reason is that the gap between the leadership skills need to be by the time we step into leadership role is simply larger because as individual contributors, we don't hone in the personal skills and leadership skills as much as people in sales, marketing, and HR. We focus just on really complex and abstract problem solving as individual contributors. And so as a result, many of us feel stuck or overwhelmed by the time we get into leadership roles. At Scalable Leaders, we focus on giving leaders that extra support system to unlock their potential, fast-track their growth, and avoid burnout. It's a support system that's designed to be the fastest way for leaders in tech to level up. In this series, however, of Fireside Chats with established leaders in our tech ecosystem, we wanted to demystify what the journey as a leader looks like in reality, shine a light on common mistakes, and understand how leaders are managing the demands of their roles today. And today, we're also going to focus on how some decisions are actually easy to make, but just feel hard in execution, and that tends to hold us back from just making them faster. With me, I've got Yaniv. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about what you do today and what that means on a day-to-day basis before we talk about your transition into leadership.
Thanks, Ben. Excited to be here. So you have actually caught me on a bit of a career transition or career break. So until the end of last year, I was founder and COO at Circular, which is a venture-backed tech company with the mission of accelerating the adoption of the circular economy by moving to more of a leasing and subscription model for subscription electronics. I actually, like I said, wrapped up my role there at the end of last year. That is not widely known. Yep. This is probably the first forum in which it's been announced to more than one or two people at a time. World exclusive. You heard it here first, folks. And, I guess I'm still deciding exactly what I want to do next, but I guess I'm at the point in my career where I have a little bit of a portfolio career anyway. So I have the Startup Podcast, as you mentioned, which turns out to be quite a time-consuming thing to do. I advise a number of startups. I invest in startups. I'm on the board of a tech-focused not-for-profit and do various things like that. But also I am now a stay-at-home parent. I'm cooking dinner most nights and things like that, which is a nice change.
Excellent. All righty. Well, there's a lot for us to dive into, especially I think the transition of being an employee and a leader at a company versus being a founder and then a thought leader as well. Let's see how much of that we'll get around to today. Now, tell us a bit about sort of your early career journey when you first stepped into a leadership role. What was the journey? How did you get picked as a leader? And what was sort of your first assignment as a leader? What was that like?
It's a funny story, actually. So, I kind of hung around at university for quite a while, ended up doing a PhD in computer science. And that's partly because I was sort of lazy, partly because I was interested, and partly because I actually graduated from my undergrad around the time of the dot bomb, the tech wreck, and I couldn't get a job. So a combination of those. So I actually ended up with my first full-time job was at Google in their Zurich office in Switzerland. And after a year there as a software engineer, I was working on one team and we had a kind of a sibling team. And the tech lead, the leader of that sibling team, was moving to a new role. And my
Mm,
manager pulled me into a room and he said, "So as you know, that person's leaving and we need to find someone to be the tech lead." And I'm sitting there going, "Yep, okay. Why are you talking to me about this? What can I do to help?" And he said to me, "You're a candidate." And I said, I've only had I've only worked here for about 11 months. What about the obvious candidate?" And he said, the obvious candidate turned down the offer. So for those who are Simpsons fans, default are the two sweetest words in the English language. I kind
yeah,
of got the role by default. But of course, there were other possible people. And I think,
yeah.
the reason I got picked as the leader is because I'm outspoken, and I sort of showed from very early on a focus on getting things done and a focus on outcomes.
Mm. That outcome focus is something we've talked about quite a bit, and yeah, I think it's so important. I mean, obviously, as a product person, I'd say that, but is that something that was like there in you right from the start? Or is that something that you developed sort of throughout your career?
I think it was there in me from the start, and it's something that I've had to refine. And one of my principles, I guess, that I find explains some of it is I call it enlightened laziness, or something like that, which is really, I think, from very early on I had this concept that I hated wasted effort. Right? Some people just like working, they like doing stuff. I'm like, I'd rather do nothing. If I'm going to do something, it better deliver some value. And so I think from very early on, I got used to the idea of questioning, right? Of
Yeah,
questioning, why are we doing this? Is there a more efficient way of doing it? What is the purpose? How do we know if we've succeeded? All of this stuff. And I was lucky enough to have landed in a place like Google where that was considered to be good leadership. There are other places
yeah,
where they'd be like, this person's a pain in the ass. Let's sort of bury them. But I think at Google, I was asking the difficult questions. I was
mm,
suggesting alternative, more efficient ways of doing things. And yes, it was something that, like I said, came somewhat naturally to me, but
mm.
also something that is something that I've deliberately made the choice to invest in over time.
Yeah, I remember like 20 years ago, so reading articles on like what great engineering is, and there were some advocates at the time saying, well, real engineers are actually lazy and like in the best possible way. And one of the people I tried to hire at the time for my startup, I think he put it in a very good way. He said, the best code I've ever written is not there because I didn't write it, or rather, I removed it, later on and simplified. And I think that, yeah, there's a quote from Einstein as well, right? Like if I had 1 hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes on figuring out the problem, and then 5 minutes on actually, effort into the solution, because by that time it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's easier. So it's sort of in history. I feel like we always keep coming back to that actually, yeah, if you do something, then if you can be really targeted in that way, it's a great habit.
Yeah, well, actually, yes. I mean, it's interesting. So, yeah, I think that quote I'd actually heard attributed to Lincoln, but there's an even better quote, which I love. And he was actually a German general in the Prussian army, a guy called Kurt von Hammerstein-Eckword. And he said, I just looked it up. I divide my officers into 4 classes as follows: the clever, the industrious, the lazy, and the stupid. Each officer always possesses 2 of these qualities. So basically, your classic Foursquare, right? And he said,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
those who are clever and industrious, I appoint to the general staff. Under certain circumstances, those who are stupid and lazy can be useful. The man who is clever and lazy qualifies for the highest leadership posts. He has the requisite
Mm.
and the mental clarity for difficult decisions. But whoever is stupid and industrious must be got rid of, for he is too dangerous. So,
Oh yeah,
uh,
it's
I find it very amusing, but also very true in a sense, right?
mm,
It's that sense. It's the lazy person, that desire for leverage on your investment, whether it's time, money, whatever it is.
yeah.
That drive is what makes for good leadership.
Yeah, and I think there's a parallel here to building startups, right? You have
Mm,
some people who are very industrious, but they don't do like they're not stupid by capability, but stupid by not having done the right things, not having the right insights. They end up running really fast with their startup, but just in the wrong direction, because they haven't
yeah.
asked their customers the questions.
Yeah,
all
and
that.
it's sad to see, right? There are no prizes
Yeah.
for effort in startups, right? You can have great intentions, work really hard, and it does not matter if you're not solving the right problems.
Yeah, indeed. All right, so let's talk about sort of you got that promotion into leadership by default, and how did you think of yourself and your leadership style at the time? Who inspired you as a leader, and what did you sort of try to incorporate into your own leadership style?
Well, okay, so those are two slightly different questions. At the very beginning
Yeah.
of my journey, um, I didn't have a single fixed inspiration, and I was kind of figuring it out as I went along, to be honest. And,
Mm,
I wasn't at Google in the super early days. This was around 2007, but it was still at a
mm,
point where the company was a scale up rather than a giant tech behemoth, and was figuring out a
mm,
lot of the stuff itself as it went along. So there was no management training. There was nothing like that. And,
mm,
I think I kind of stuck with what I had, which was this sense that the effort of my team needed to be well spent. And that meant making sure that the people on that team were working on the right things in the right way and collaborating and communicating effectively. So that served me fairly well for that early stage of leadership.
mm,
And then the leader who really inspired me came, just a couple of years, 1 or 2 years after that. There was someone called Oliver Heckman, and he is now VP of Engineering at Coda, the large document unicorn,
mm,
also a sponsor of the Startup Podcast. He was at the time the Director of Engineering at YouTube. So when I moved across to YouTube, he was my manager there. And that was also when I moved into actual people management rather than just team leadership. I was then had, people management responsibility. And what I found inspiring about Oliver then and now as a leader is that he had high expectations, but you felt
mm.
like he always had your back, right? So it was this sense of he induced this psychological safety, which I think is sort of an easy, like it's easy to say psychological safety. It's very hard to do it right. And I think he did it right, where I felt that I could go to him with all my problems. He would give me great advice. He would expect me to solve a lot of them myself, but he would go into bat for me whenever it was needed. And so it felt
Mm.
like a partnership, right? Where he was the senior partner and I was the junior partner, but it's not like he was my boss and I was his underling. We were doing it together, and I found that really inspiring. And I think that's something that I've tried to take to my own leadership from then on.
Yeah, awesome. That's interesting. Is that approach, does that sort of incorporate leading through questions rather than like giving people answers?
Absolutely. I think it's a lot about questioning. It's a lot. I mean, it's funny that I feel like the earth is a bit salted with this stuff because all of these concepts have been so watered down when you talk about psychological safety or empowering your teams and so on. But I try to do the not watered down version of that wherever possible, where it's like, yes, your job as a leader is to set clear expectations, to hold people
Mm.
accountable to those expectations, but at the same time to help them meet those expectations, right? It's not a test. It's
Yeah.
you're not testing them, you're helping them along the way. But you also give them a lot of agency, and you lead by questioning them. And actually, and sorry, I'm happy to move on in a moment, but something just came to my mind. There was actually a leader who inspired me early on, and that was when I was doing my PhD. My supervisor is a person called Justin Zobel, who now is a pro vice chancellor at the University of Melbourne, and
Mm.
he led by questioning. And in a sense, as a PhD supervisor, he was my first manager. And I had other friends studying PhDs, and they were always complaining about how crap their supervisor was, and I just couldn't empathize because mine was great.
Mm.
And he gave me ideas, he held me accountable, and he asked me questions, and that allowed me to actually develop my own skills. With his help, rather than being scared of my weekly
Yeah.
meetings with him, I actually looked forward to them.
That's awesome. And actually, in the way you've described sort of that approach to leadership, you've really nailed sort of the three principles that I try to teach people and that are part of the Scalable Leaders curriculum as well. The first one being, I'm going to simplify drastically here now, but create clarity or bring clarity to your team. What are we working towards? Where do we want to be? What are the guardrails? And what's the order of priorities? I think most teams in tech would crave to at least understand on a continuous basis the order of priorities. The second one is generate energy, and that starts with creating psychological safety and actually taking anxiety out of the out of the team, and then making sure people are in positive spirits. And the third one is empower them and give them the skills and tools and questions and processes to ultimately be a setup for success. And ideally that means autonomy, but only when people are ready. But the questioning is sort of I find that the most powerful way, instead of giving people the answers, to help them understand them themselves and put them on a growth journey. That's where the most learning comes from. Now, let's talk about mistakes. And I know we've talked about this a little bit, and sort of forms the title of this particular episode. I often ask people, what's the hardest decision you've had to make? And often the answer is, well, letting people go. And when we talked about it, you had sort of a slightly different take on this. Talk us through this.
Yeah, so letting people go is a really interesting one, right? I think people say it's the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I would have said that in the past as well. But what I realized is, in most cases, letting someone go is quite an easy decision to make if you abstract it, right? If you remove the personal element. What it is a really difficult decision to execute on, right? So if you look at someone objectively, and the way you can tell that this is the case is it's always easy to think how some other manager, some other leader should fire an underperformer on their team. You're like, oh, look, that person's clearly underperforming, letting their team down. They should let them go. It's obvious. But then when it comes to someone on your team, unless you're a sociopath, shout out to all the sociopaths on the call. But for the rest of us, it sucks to fire people. It is unpleasant. It brings up a lot of emotion. It makes you feel bad. And so the thing that makes it feel like a hard decision is actually thinking about the fact that you're going to have to execute it, and that's going to be unpleasant. So it's not usually a hard decision. What I actually find is that letting someone go, if you put yourself in the right frame of mind, is usually a very easy decision, in the sense that nearly everybody, again, except for the sociopaths out there, waits far too long to let somebody go, in my opinion. And so by the time you are really agonizing over whether to let someone go, as far as I'm concerned, that decision's really only already made, and the agonizing is really a symptom of the fact that you don't feel like doing it, not that you don't know it's a right decision to make. Yeah.
There's a lot to be said there about just how self-management is important to leaders, but or to being a good leader. But you remind me of something that Ben Horowitz has written in his book, Hard Thing About Hard Things, where when people make redundancies, right, for company performance reasons, often there is this feeling that, oh, this is a great time to get rid of all the low performers. And his take is, well, that is the worst way to look at it, because A, if they are low performers, you probably should have gotten rid of them in the first place. And B, if you have this sentiment when you have to get rid of people, it's the wrong way to start, because you have to get rid of people because you as a leader failed, right? Or the company, you're getting rid of people for company performance, not for individual performance. And that needs to be very, very clear in the communication. And I think some companies, especially during COVID, did that pretty well and went out of the way to make sure that everyone in market understood we have to let go of people. They are great people, but we have to let go of them. I think Airbnb did some fantastic efforts there.
Airbnb is the clear example of that done well.
Yeah, famous. But I still see it today with some startups that just have to go through redundancies. They are a lot of the leaders put the people they have to let go first before themselves and say, look, these are great people, please help them find a new job. And then they get around to them as leaders starting their own job journey. And I think that says a lot about their character and the priorities. All right, sorry, I took us on a slightly different route there.
That's fun.
Now, I think the hard decisions, sometimes we still end up in the on the wrong side of the decision, and we make mistakes, right? Every leader has made mistakes throughout their career. What were some of the mistakes that you've made early on, that looking back you're like, oh gee, I should have done that differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's always the people mistakes that haunt you, right? And so the one that sticks in my memory is I had a person on the team who was very high performing from the point of view of technically excellent. Also, someone I personally got along with quite well. But he was also kind of a bit unpleasant and obnoxious to other people. And I dismissed that for a long time as, oh, well, he's a bit of a pain in the ass, but, let's call this guy Sam. You say, oh, well, that's just Sam. And I've learned that it's just X is actually a great warning sign. It's a great red light. So what it turned out is, okay, so it was a bit obnoxious to some people, but it turns out that a number of women on my team, and I unusually had a fairly gender balanced team I was managing, were made to feel uncomfortable by him. And I think over time it became clear that he had some sexist tendencies or some biases against women. And it's not that I didn't take it seriously, or I felt I was taking it seriously at the time. I mediated. I gave him a lot of feedback. I brought people together. I supported the women who were affected by it. But actually, none of that was enough, right? And that's the sort of behavior that ultimately should just not be tolerated. So it's not something that you coach someone out of. If it's repeated behavior and like a single warning doesn't suffice, then unfortunately you need to do something for the overall safety of your team. And I didn't do that. And a few years later, I heard from one of the women on the team who said that she still felt negatively impacted by it. To be clear, there was no, harassment or assault or abuse or, physical abuse like that, but it was a psychological abuse. And, I guess I didn't realize at the time how deeply that can impact people. And, that's a mistake that I would never want to make again.
Thank you so much for sharing and being so open about that. It's a really tough one, right? I think we see this again and again. I think that the sentiment is starting to shift, but a lot of leaders today, like especially the ones just getting into leadership roles, wanting to kick goals, etc., wanting to hold on to the high performers in their team, I'm not gonna say names either, but a friend of mine was working at a company, a woman, and at the Christmas party, there were several remarks being made in her direction by a new leader at that organization who was hired from a prestigious company, and people really wanted him to succeed and felt like this is going to uplift the capability of the team and all these things, and none of the comments were okay. And there was ultimately an HR complaint, but it was handled so poorly that it made her feel like she didn't even matter. It's there was no warning. There was not even a oh, okay, I guess it was just a misunderstanding. So it's hard, not just for new leaders, but then also for the HR teams around it, etc. But yeah, I'm glad that we're seeing a lot more action on these things these days. So yeah, thank you for sharing. It's really important, that topic.
Yep, it's not worth sacrificing your humanity for in the end.
No, it's not. As a leader today, and I know you've it's been a little while since Airtasker, but then you've had your own startup as a COO. What are you known for as a leader today? The good and the bad. Where do you make your own trade-offs, I guess?
Yeah. And of course, to get a really good answer to this question, you'd have to ask the people who have worked with me. But here's my best guess for what I'm known for and the good and the bad. So I think starting with the good, I think I am known as a very first principles thinker. I ask, like you said, I ask questions. I think that's really important. I get to the nub of why we're doing what we're doing. What's the point? Are we doing it the right way? And also not just asking the questions, but proposing solutions that are well aligned with our goals. I think that's one thing I'm known for. I think I'm known for quite clear communication and for being a relatively empathetic leader. I think the bad is at times I can become a bit disconnected from the detail of the day-to-day. I think this is something I felt more, especially at Circular as an earlier stage startup, where it's like, okay, you talk about hands-on leadership. I do find that I spend a lot of my time, at that kind of more abstract level of goals and people and organization. And I think that's all very valuable.
Mm.
But sometimes I don't get enough into the weeds. And, as with all things, there is balance. I think there are a lot of leaders who are too much in the weeds. I think there have been times, and I've had this feedback and accepted that feedback, where I have not gotten my hands sufficiently dirty. We talked about my skincare routine before. Beautiful hands, never done an honest day's work in their life.
We'll get to that. Good teeth.
So yeah, I think those are some of their strengths. And the other bad one is, we talked about the difference between decisions that are hard to make and decisions that are hard to execute. I have certainly at times allowed myself sort of to pull my punches, to not follow through on things that actually I've known and my team has known that I should do. Not only letting people go. That's a very common theme, right? As I'm sure you're aware, but more broadly, it's like having the courage of my convictions and actually following through is something that I would say I'm inconsistent at, and something I always work to improve.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Let's dive into that for a second, because the flip side of that is someone who's just constantly rocking the boat, right? Which I suppose I've been known to do. When you're aligned on the goals and you've thought about them, you've thought deeply about the solutions, and you understand that, all right, well, the current solutions that the team is working towards and through just aren't going to get us there, or are going to get us there so slowly that we're ultimately still going to miss the mark or expose ourselves to competitive risks, etc. But there's sort of a balance between, all right, well, currently people aren't aligned with that new way of thinking. Do you push through and sort of rock the boat a little bit, but the outcome is going to be better, or do you pull your punch and sort of see potentially that risk materialize? And there's never any value in saying at the end, well, I told you so, right?
Well, here's my thinking on it. And maybe this is a little bit too extreme. And like I said, I'm inconsistent in practicing it. They talk about picking your battles. And I think reluctantly, I agree, you need to pick your battles. But the battles that you pick, you fight them hard, right? So you don't pull your punches. If you take a swing, you follow through, right? You don't half-ass things, because that is the worst of both worlds. It's like, we should do this, but then you put a bit of effort in and it fizzles out halfway, and you allow it to be compromised by, bureaucratic whatever, and you don't put enough force behind it to actually land the punch. You can choose a less violent metaphor if you like, but it remains, right? It's like, do or do not. Like, pick whether you're going to fight the battle, and then the ones that you do want to fight them properly. Put the resources behind them.
Maybe the less violent analogy is your course of antibiotics, right? If you take one, we'll take the whole course and not stop halfway, because at that point you've just actually helped the bacteria become more resistant.
Well, I mean, we're still killing things there, right, Ben? They just happen to be bacteria.
Oh, well. The new brave world of working hybrid or remote, which, I mean, we've been doing it for a while, but currently we see a lot of companies sort of go back to asking people to come to the office full time. Where do you stand on that, and how did you adjust to? I think Circular was actually sort of an international company very early on. Yeah, how have you adjusted?
I mean, not amazingly well, I would say. In fact, we've recorded an episode of the Startup Podcast on the topic of remote versus in-person versus hybrid. So I guess my thinking on that is sort of top of mind at the moment. But I think that what I've concluded is that we've gone from a very simple world where it is, you all work in person. That's just what you do. You go to the office, right? And then we went from that to actually another pretty simple world during COVID, which is you're all remote because there's a lockdown and you all work from home. And so I think either in-person or remote are both relatively simple in that they are absolutes, right? And then you talk about hybrid, and the way to think about this is imagine you've got a spectrum with in-person at one end and remote at the other end. Hybrid is not one thing. Hybrid is every point in between. And I think the mistake that most companies make, that most leaders make, is not choosing which of the nearly infinite versions of hybrid they are going with, right? So you kind of end up with this sort of mishmash where you're like, oh, well, we're mostly in person, but we're flexible, or we're hybrid, but we expect people to come into the office. But, nobody, like, this team, they never come into the office at the same time. So do we need a new policy? And it's all very ad hoc. And so I think what it means is the advent of the possibility of remote work and I guess the normalization through COVID means that leaders now have another set of decisions they need to make that they simply did not have to make before, which is what is our set of policies that we have around our work policy. Used to be simple, now it's not. In this upcoming episode, we break down what are the different decisions you need to make. But as with most things, the most important thing is to make deliberate choices rather than be ad hoc. I feel there are very few companies who have done this well, including those that I've been responsible for.
Yeah, it's hard, right? I think even first thing to acknowledge is I think most people listening to the podcast will probably be in a position where the company gives them policy and they sort of have to champion that to their team without having a real say themselves, even if they don't really agree to that policy. But I feel like a lot of organizations feel like they've made a very firm decision because the decision is, all right, 3 days in the office, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and that's it. But there's so many decisions on top of that need to be made about, well, how do you actually make that a level playing field when people are in the office and when they're remote, right? How much do you invest into office equipment? Do you restructure the way the office works to give people phone booths? Because there's always going to be someone who's going to be remote. What do you do if some people are remote and some people are in person? And it's like all the micro decisions to satisfy the needs of the organization and the processes and the collaboration, as well as the needs of the individuals of flexibility being apparent, and some people being more extroverted, more introverted, etc. So that's where it becomes just so blurry and much more intricate. And you talked about this at the beginning. I feel like a lot of CEOs sort of stay at, or the people making the decisions stay at the very high level of what is the right policy, and don't go enough into the details of what, and now how do we make that work really well. And so I see just a lot of half-assed setups.
Well, like I said, I use the word design. I think the word design is underutilized in general. It's sort of been put in this little corner where it's like, how do things look? No, design is how things work. And if you want your team to work well together, it's called work, right? You're at work. Yeah. Actually design your work environment. And I think, we've added this huge new degree of freedom, which is the possibility to work remotely. You have to design that. And design takes thoughtfulness. And I think that's often the thing that's missing. Just the one thing I would add to all of that is, unless you are a fully remote environment, which is, a handful of organizations around the world, I would believe, it is important to get people all together at the same time. I do think that's important. We're humans. We are made of meat. We've evolved that way to be in the same room, to smell each other, to see each other in 3D, in high definition, all of that. And so even if you are fairly remote or somewhat hybrid, I think it is really important to, again, design for the team to all get together and get to know each other in that real world space, IRL. So I think that's sort of my one nearly universal guideline that I would give.
Yeah. And I think a few organizations that define themselves as fully remote, like Buffer and Atlassian, do that with saying, well, once a quarter or once a year, or however the cadence, we do get together in person for a day, a quarter, or a week, a year, or something like that to do that, because they've realized how important that is. I think the rest of the world is still looking at us like, why would we pay for a week's vacation for all of our employees, right?
So that's one thing we did very much right at Circular, is that we had a twice annually company retreat. It was actually in Bali, so it was pretty awesome, right? It was very clear that the aim of this is, although there was a work component, this was about getting to know each other as people, building up that trust and that sort of that human connection that then allows us to be more effective when we all go back to our own countries and are, in different places and different time zones, and we're, little pixelated videos that we can actually trust each other and know where each other are coming from more effectively.
Yeah, and that is work itself, right? So
Absolutely.
I love the way you define that. It happens organically. It happens in the cracks of like the meetings at an in-person organization, but it's still work. It happens. It takes up time, and so just it's just different. It's not better or worse doing it that way. Fantastic.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal.
Leadership is inherently stressful, and I think, sure, as an employee, as an executive of a company taking like public, of course, but then being a founder sort of has yet another degree of stress to it, because there's nobody else you can blame above you, other than, I guess, your investors. How do you manage yourself in sort of staying sane and keeping your stress levels to a point where you feel like you can still be effective and a good human being as a leader?
So I've got two answers to this, which are kind of different lenses to the same principle. One is, what they call like, pay yourself first, or, put your own oxygen mask on before helping others or whatever, which is this concept of, if you are investing in others or helping others or investing in your future, there's always going to be demands on your time, on your emotional energy, on your attention. The only way to make sure that you are looking after yourself and managing that stress is to set aside that time for yourself first, right? So whatever it is you need, if it's, time with your family, time to exercise, time to do some meditation, time to watch Netflix, whatever it is, no matter how stressful and important your job is, you will not be good at it over the long term if you don't look after yourself. People are depending on you. If you allow yourself to burn out, flame out catastrophically, you are not doing right by all the people you are there to serve. So look after yourself. That is actually a part of your job, as well as all the myriad other things you need to do. And if you wait to look after yourself in just the little bits of time that are left over from helping everyone else, well, guess what? Most of the time, there won't be any time left over, which is why you need to set the time aside first and make it non-negotiable. So I think that's one kind of lens on it. And I guess the other one, which I posted about a few months ago, is a sort of a principle that I call caring a lot, but not too much. I think, like with most things, the ancient Greeks had it right. Everything in moderation, everything in balance. And I think, startup culture, grind culture, a lot of this stuff, it glorifies absolute extreme commitment. And in particular in founders, it glorifies fusing your own identity with the identity of your startup. Right? Which means that your level of caring is nearly infinite. I mean, for those of you who are parents, right? Like, you love your child, you would do anything for your child. You kind of fuse your identity with your child. Your startup is not your child, right? In some ways it is, but actually, you're allowed to kill your startup. So that's one big difference.
And you can sell part of it to other people.
Yeah, that's right. There are a lot of things that are perfectly legal to do with your startup that you would end up in jail if you did it to your kid. So I think that already, that's a clue, right? Which is that what you want to do, a startup is something where you do have a kind of responsibility to maximize its chance of success. And if it's going to fail in an orderly and kind of timely way. Right? A startup is a type of experiment. You don't know it will succeed. Fusing your identity to it makes it very hard to make rational decisions, because suddenly you see yourself as your startup. You put everything into it. You forget about yourself. And that's really bad. And, if you talk to doctors especially doctors like oncologists who deal with patients who have, a survival rate that is not incredibly high, they are there to help those people. Sometimes they'll see them survive. Other times they will see them die. If you want to be a good oncologist, you can't take it too deeply to heart every time one of your patients die. And it's hard. And they call that professional detachment, right? And I think caring a lot, but not too much, is about saying, yes, nearly every waking moment is taken up with your startup. That's it's nearly appropriate. But then when you're with your kid, when you're doing exercise, when you're on holiday, when the startup is failing, most startups fail, you need to have enough of yourself left that you can make the right decisions and that you can be a complete human being.
That's awesome. That is really great advice for a lot of founders. Actually, something I wish I had heard when I had my first startup. Great. Now let's translate that into advice for emerging leaders, right? And like the situation I hear a lot that they are in, and in the current cohort, we've got actually 4 of them in the same group, all like on that like cusp of leadership. Some of them have a couple of reports, some of them have like it's been formalized. Their title is head of product, but they're still sort of in that mindset of, well, I need to prove myself and I need to do everything sometimes. What's your best advice for sort of those emerging leaders?
I've got a couple. So I think the key one, and it's sort of trite to the point of being tautological, but I think it's important, is to show value, right? Showing value is not about showing, it's not about time at desk. And, I guess I'll caveat this with, okay, it depends what your workplace is. If you have to adapt this to your workplace culture. Although if you're in a workplace culture that values only optics rather than actual delivery of value to your stakeholders, I would consider whether that's a good place to be working. But, in general, think about, how do I provide value to my stakeholders? Ideally to my customers, whoever they are, but also to my leadership, to my team, and so on. And focus on being valuable rather than on doing activity, right? So that's that shift in mindset, which is, all the influencers, I guess, including myself, say it, but it's easier said than done, to move from a output orientation, or even more from a just time at desk orientation, from an optics orientation to an outcome orientation. There are no points for trying. We talked about this earlier, right? It only matters if you're actually demonstrating value. And so taking a step back, we come back again to this principle of enlightened laziness, or whatever you want to call it. It is a question of maximizing your leverage. It's like, instead of thinking how many hours can I work, it is how much value can I deliver for every hour that I work. And therefore, the metric is no longer number of hours worked. It is value delivered. And, I guess that old statement, work smarter, not harder, again, it's not wrong in that sense. And I guess the other bit of advice I would have is actually around disagreeableness. We were sort of asking, you were asking before, Ben, about my leadership journey and why I was sort of picked out for leadership. I held no formal leadership roles at school or university. It's not, it wasn't sort of, again, that's why I was sort of so surprised. But I think one thing that was interesting is, because I always learned to care enough, but not too much, I set clear boundaries. I learned how to say no early on. In places, even, to people who are higher status than me, and so on. I learned how to say it politely and respectfully. I learned how to say, if you want me to do thing B, that means I'll have less time to spend on thing A. Do you still want me to do it? And what that made me seem is like someone who really took this stuff seriously, right? Who understood how the world worked, who respected themselves as well as respecting others, wasn't just a pushover, and therefore, as someone who was worthy of leadership, the lazy and intelligent general, right? And I would again, you never want, and you have to adapt this to the culture of your workplace. I will mention that again, but I have been fortunate enough that I have never had long-term blowback for standing up for myself. Sometimes in the short term, I pissed off the wrong person, but then I found that other people who observed the interaction ended up respecting me more. And so that's been something where I'm like, oh, okay, actually valuing yourself in the workplace, not being arrogant, not being entitled, but just valuing yourself as you should, and using that to set boundaries is a weird hack for increasing the degree to which other people respect you. Because if you don't respect yourself, then other people kind of won't either. They won't respect your time any more than you do yourself.
Yeah, that's awesome. All righty. Well, I think we've got some great stuff in here already, but I know the question almost everyone on the stream is craving the answer for is, Yaniv, why is your skin so smooth? Let's do the big reveal.
I take a liter of fresh cream every morning and I slather it all over my body and I leave it on for 30 minutes while singing opera.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. So this is part of the reserved time for yourself. It's that liter of cream and singing opera. Excellent. Okay. Yeah. Well, there you go, folks. You've heard it here first.
You can all leave the stream now. We've teased it. Now you've got the answer.
All righty. Cool. So we've got a question from Alexander. It's a long one, so I have to work my way through that. So on disagreeableness, when you step into a product leadership role in a startup, it's usually taking work away from the CEO, CPO. And how have you experienced that transition? And what are some of the challenges in that transition, like working with, the executives or the founders, I guess, even themselves?
It's really hard. um, it's really hard. Actually, one of my favorite thought leaders in product that some of you will be familiar with is John Cutler. I'm actually really excited. We're interviewing him on the podcast this Friday. And, his newsletter is called The Beautiful Mess. And what I love about his thinking is he doesn't come up with these sort of very clean prescriptions like do A and do B and then you'll succeed. He accepts that it's actually really messy, especially leading in product. And that involves a lot of nuance and texture and whatnot. And so I think that is true, right? And I think the correct answer to nearly any question in reality is it depends. It is so contextual, right? But I think the first thing you need to do with the CEO and CPO, which is like you say, you're taking work away from them, or you're taking a bit of ownership away from them, is to build that trust. And it's difficult, and I certainly won't say I've always succeeded at this. So I'm not going to hold myself up as like I know exactly how this is done. But you need to adapt yourself to them. The way to think about it is when you join any organization, but especially in a startup, the CEO and the CPO, whoever it is, like the leader who you are most responsible for working with, they're a certain shape. And their shape is kind of hard. You're going to have to mold yourself to them. They're not going to mold themselves to you. Now, the choice you have is, do you like the shape that they are? And that's something that you should really try to figure out in the interview process. It's really easy to think when you're interviewing for a role is like, I'm trying to get the job. But there's that old truism, which is like, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. Because what you need to ask yourself is, am I comfortable molding myself to this type of leader? Because you will have to mold yourself. And so I think, disagreeableness means standing up for yourself and for your ideas and so on. It doesn't, being disagreeable, it's a personality trait, right? It doesn't mean, I'm grumpy and I'm always the naysayer. It means I am questioning things. I stand up for myself. I'm willing to endure a certain amount of social ostracism for my beliefs. That's disagreeableness. But you absolutely have to build that trust and figure out the right way to mold yourself to your leader without actually losing yourself. It's messy. It's a messy thing to do. Therefore, it's a messy answer. But I think that's the best I can do.
Yeah, but I would agree. I think I've worked with so many founders myself as a consultant or employee, etc. And the problem is they are, and I've been a founder myself, I can say this, often they are just very unreasonable human beings, right? They've got these huge ambitions, barely the skills or resources to even get, the first 100 meters into the race of getting to their goals. And the goalpost also shifts a fair bit. A lot of them are, very creative and disruptive and impulsive individuals. And so often by the time the task is assigned, things change behind the scenes and the goalposts have shifted, and it often doesn't get communicated particularly well because the stability of a large organization isn't always there. And so, that sort of adds another level of complexity into it. I think you touched on it earlier, right? Pick your battles and know what you as a leader going into that situation, what you stand for and what you want to be firm on. And there's going to be a lot of things that founders won't and CEOs and executives won't budge on. And you have to learn fast what these things are. That'd be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah.
Now we have questions pouring in now. Let's go with Sunny here. What would you tell your younger self not to do or should have done, sort of looking back on your journey?
I guess this is more, more something I should have done more of is to plan and design that work again, the arc of my career. I think I have relied a little bit too much on serendipity. I've also, I think, stayed too long in certain roles, and in particular Google. I was there for 10 years. It's an easy place to stay. but it's not necessarily the right thing to stay for that long. And I think, I'm quite fortunate in where I'm at in my career. I'm fairly happy with that, but I don't think I put the thought into it that I could have. And, one of the things is that mindset shift that I think not a lot of people never make this mindset shift, and a lot of people don't make it until later in life when they could benefit from doing it earlier, is to go from having a job orientation to a career orientation, which is to say, your career is made up of a series of jobs, and as you become more senior, it often it fragments a little bit into little businesses and side hustles and stuff like that, sometimes with a job, sometimes without a job. How do you design that career for you? What are you trying to learn? What are you trying to achieve? What are your goals? Rather than, I'm working in this job and then what is my next job? And so that's something that I think being more intentional, putting more design into it, is something I would tell my younger self.
That's an interesting one, because I've got a counterpoint on that. Is when I worked at Atlassian, and I, like yourself, I realized that, oh, this is a place that can be very comfortable for a really long time. And I was concerned about it, and figured, well, do I want to be better at learning the Atlassian way, or do I want to grow as a leader in more diverse ways? So I actually made that decision to leave early on, but apparently, according to recruiters, too early. I was only there for a year and a half, to the point where people then always started looking at, well, what's wrong with this guy for only staying a year and a half there, and prioritizing the growth journey in a different way. So there's certainly a balance to be kept there. If you're looking at
I would say I got triggered. So I love recruiters, or I love some recruiters. We might have some on the call. They perform a really valuable role, but I would not be taking career advice from them. That recruiters have a different set of incentives to an individual. And I would say, serving time at a role where you don't feel that you are growing to satisfy recruiters is not advice I would give anybody.
No, there's probably some value in that, especially when the tech ecosystem. Over the last couple of years, it hasn't. Over the last year, it hasn't grown as much, but it looks like we're on the way up again, and just more roles than people, at least soon. All right, we're gonna have time for one or two more questions. I'll go with this one first from Adam. Any foolproof method of delivering respectful feedback? Now, I could point to the Scalable Leaders program where we actually have a template for that, but what's your take on this one?
Okay, so I've got a slightly smart alecky answer, but there's something to it, which is the foolproof way to deliver respectful feedback is to be respectful. And actually, I had a post just yesterday on LinkedIn, which bombed for some reason. I put quite a lot of effort into it about delivering feedback. So Adam, maybe you can go give it a like and a reshare. But there's this thing, feedback is a gift. And what I was doing was actually unpacking that, because it sort of sounds like just a motherhood and apple pie statement. But actually, gift giving and gift receiving have protocols, right? And it's only a gift if you are trying to make someone's life better. If you care about them and you want to give them something that will help them or that they will enjoy. And then when you receive a gift, you are supposed to say thank you. You're not supposed to say, actually, I don't like this gift or whatever, even if you don't. It's a respectful interaction, because you recognize that, the giver has good intentions and the receiver needs to honor those good intentions. So I think if you take the good intentions, that respect, and then you as part of respecting that, you actually put some thought into how you package the feedback. And again, that's perhaps where Scalable Leaders fits in, and there are other great resources, of course, for different frameworks or different ways of delivering feedback. But there is no foolproof method, and I think maybe this is what you're getting to ensuring your feedback is well received. You can only hope. You can give your gift to someone and they can say, well, this is shit, I already have it, don't you know me? Okay, that is out of your control. You can only control what you control, which is how much thought have you put into the gift? Do you know the person? Have you, have you wrapped it up nicely? And so that's pretty much what it is.
Yeah, awesome. And I'd agree with that. I think, there's a lot of ways in which you can package it, and a lot of things to consider of how that person might be feeling, what headspace they're in, etc. And you can control to some extent when you give it, how you prime someone, what space you give them. So there's a lot to it to sort of soften the blow without making it less effective, and still ensuring that. But it's certainly an art and a whole craft on its own. So I wanna wrap it up and say, Yaniv, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure for you to share so many gems, so much knowledge, so much insight. Thank you. Do you have anything else in your mind that you would like to share with our audience before we wrap it up?
No, that's about all. Just in terms of where you can find me, like I do share my thoughts in two places in particular. So one is LinkedIn. I'd love it if you could all give me a follow or even a connection and tell me you're connecting from this seminar. I'd love to be connected to you all. And the other thing is a startup podcast. That's gone from a little side hustle to something a bit more significant than that. And if you enjoyed this session, I'm sure there are quite a few listeners already, but give it a go. At least one person has said it's the thing that turned them into a regular podcast listener. So I'd love to have more listeners and of course, feedback, episode suggestions, and so on.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining, everybody, and big kudos for spending your lunchtime hour to, or whenever you do it, for anyone listening later, to invest in your leadership skills and mastering leadership, into your own knowledge and understanding of how this all works. That sort of investment and curiosity is a huge asset to the ecosystem at large. I hope I see you on the next one.
If you're interested in learning a little bit more about what Ben and Scalable Leaders do, I strongly encourage you to follow him on LinkedIn and check out scalableleaders.com. Ben is one of the most thoughtful and talented leadership coaches I know. I strongly encourage you to check it out. And of course, do not forget the Startup Podcast Pact. If you've been listening to this podcast for more than a few episodes and been getting value about it, that means you've implicitly signed up to the Startup Podcast Pact. You have to, as part of this pact, follow us in your favorite listening app, subscribe on YouTube, and give us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have an audience. It helps us grow the podcast, and more listeners means better production, means new shows, means better guests. So it's a win-win. Please help us out. We are eternally grateful every time somebody honors the pact and helps us grow. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.